Rick Santorum and the Bukakke. What in the flying anal fucks is that horrible noise? Jesus Christ. Okay. Rick Santorum and the Bukakke Crusade. Chapter 3. Rick Santorum's limp, unconscious body was thrown violently around the back of the Jesuit van as it flew like a bullet to reach wherever it was headed. 3 Jesuits, armed with guns, sat in the back of the van with Rick, while the other 2 sat in the front. All 5 of the Jesuits' mouths began to water as they anticipated the rapidly approaching proceedings. "It's a good thing we found him. You remember what the boss said would happen if we didn't find him this time, right?" the driver said to the Jesuit beside him. "Of course I do. It would be rather hard to forget such horrific words. I've never had a tiger's dick in my ear, and I certainly don't want to," the man replied. "That's what you were worried about? What about the pit of genetically engineered gay dolphins? You know those things can split a man in half with their cum, right?" "Hey, shut the fuck up, you 2. We're trying to masturbate back here," one of the Jesuits in the back shouted. The 2 Jesuits in the front did as they were instructed and remained silent for the remainder of the drive, as the 3 Jesuits in the back continued to masturbate furiously over Rick Santorum's unconscious body. All 5 of the Jesuits were instructed to refrain from doing Bukakke on Rick until he arrived at the van's destination, so once each Jesuit had finished tugging on his snaky trouser monster, he turned his body away from Rick so that the semen merely came crashing down onto the floor of the van. The ride lasted for around 1.5 hours before the van came to a grinding halt. Rick Santorum was carried into a large, featureless building that had a rainbow flag waving in its courtyard. He was then taken through the lobby and into a large, rainbow-colored room, in which around 50 Jesuits were waiting in dark robes. Rick Santorum was then slapped in the face several times by the erect member of one of the Jesuits. Rick Santorum awoke to view his surroundings. "Where am I? Who are you people?" Rick Santorum said in a hushed, frightened voice. "Come now, Mr. Santorum. You know exactly where you are, and you know exactly who we are," one of the Jesuits proclaimed. The Jesuit was right. Rick knew where he was, and he knew who all the people around him were, but he didn't want to believe it. He thought that this would never happen to him. He thought he would be safe from this horrible place and these horrible people. Unfortunately for Rick, he was quite wrong. The Jesuits had found him, and they had taken him to the worst place any of their enemies can be taken, the Jesuit homosexual compound located in San Francisco, California. Rick's clothes were then removed, and his hands were tied behind his back. 50 Jesuits then surrounded Rick, removed their black robes, and began to furiously masturbate. Their sweaty hands stroked their erect members with unimaginable passion and fury. Some of the Jesuits even began to bleed from their genitals as the speed of their strokes became so intense that they began to rip the skin right off of their members. Rick could see a burning fire in the eyes of each Jesuit as they continued to pleasure themselves. Some of the Jesuits began using both hands on their members, continuing to go faster and faster, each of them waiting for that wonderful moment when they would finally... Suddenly, 50 torrents of Jesuit semen all came flying toward Rick Santorum at once. Hot Jesuit pudding pounded Rick in the face with force equivalent to a punch by a professional boxer. Rick's mouth was then forced open, and he was forced to swallow as much semen as physically possible, and perhaps a tad more. Rick was choking and gagging on gallons and gallons of Jesuit Bukakke, and he could almost taste the AIDS swimming around inside of it. Rick knew he should be disgusted, revolted, and horrified, just as his religion dictated, but he couldn't help but slightly enjoy the semen in his mouth. He knew he was having desires for other men, but he thought they were just temptations from the devil, Richard Dawkins. He wanted so much to believe that he was heterosexual. However, thinking back on it, Rick had never made love to any woman in his entire life, not even his lover, Gail. Rick refused to accept that his urges were real, and tried as hard as he could to be disgusted or revolted by the semen in his mouth, but the more he tried, the more he seemed to enjoy it. After Rick had gulped down every last pint of the Jesuit Bukakke, Rick was bent over so that his rather loose anus was presented to the Jesuits. Each of the 50 Jesuits then began to take turns ramming their gargantuan penises into Rick's butthole. Once each Jesuit had finished, he would leave his member inside of Rick, push it in as deep as they could, and come. Each ejaculation that Rick Santorum took felt like a harpoon gun was being fired off inside of his intestines. Rick again tried to believe that he was in agony, but he couldn't. He kept finding that he enjoyed what was being done to him. After the last Jesuit had pulled out of Rick, they all gathered around to survey the damage. Despite Rick's anus being moderately loose, it had been torn and stretched an obscene amount. It is likely that one could fit an entire wine bottle or perhaps a large melon inside of Rush's anus. The Jesuits realized this and knew exactly what was to be done to Rick next. 2 Jesuits left the rainbow-colored room and entered the storage room to reveal several objects of varying shapes and sizes. These objects include baseball bats, melons, wine bottles, various fruits and vegetables, and a few Bible character action figures. And, of course, a small, live rodent. The 2 Jesuits returned to the rainbow-colored room and sat the objects down on the floor. 5 Jesuits then began inserting the objects into Rick's booty hole. They started with the baseball bat, which fit quite loosely inside of Rick. They then moved on to the wine bottle, which also fit with no problems. However, once they had inserted the first melon, there began to be a shortage on room. This did not stop the Jesuits, however, as they began to insert cucumbers and bananas into Rick's sewer spout. After they had finished inserting the Bible character action figures, including Jesus, Moses, Noah, and Job, there was absolutely no more room in Rick's asshole for any other items. Again, the Jesuits did not care. They struggled for over 15 minutes to fit the live rodent into Rick's downtown Browntown, but to no avail. They finally decided that they would have to make room. 2 Jesuits then placed both of their hands on either side of Rick's anus and began to pull as hard as they could. They finally stretched it enough and inserted the rodent between Rick's booty butt cheeks. The rodent then squirmed around inside of Rick's intestines, trying to work its way past the other items. The Jesuits all stood around a naked, gaping, semen-filled, and covered Rick Santorum, laughing at him in delight. Rick was then untied and zapped with a taser. He then fell over, unconscious, in a pool of his own anal blood and Jesuit bukkake. Oh, sweet Jesus, dear God, please no. Go away. Ye buxom temptress. Dear sweet merciful Christ, I am going to kill myself with a hammer.